The massive doors of Galactic Academy opened with a soft hiss, and Minji stepped through them for the first time. The hallway stretched out before her like a crystal canyon with walls that sparkled and shifted colors in the artificial light. Students moved through the space in groups talking in dozens of different languages, while their voices created a constant hum of conversation. Minji looked small compared to everyone around her. She stood barely 1.5 meters tall while most other students towered above her. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard academy uniform that seemed too big for her tiny frame. In one hand, she carried an old brown leather bag that looked ancient compared to the floating tech cases that everyone else used. The other students noticed her immediately. They stopped their conversations and stared as she walked past. Some pointed and whispered to their friends. Others just watched with curious expressions on their faces. A few looked at her with what might have been pity. Minji was human, and she came from Earth. The rest of the galaxy called her home planet a death world because most alien species could not survive there. The gravity was too strong for delicate species like the Velkari. The atmosphere contained gases that were toxic to beings like the crystalline Zephyrians. The weather could change from burning heat to freezing cold in a single day. Most aliens needed special suits and breathing equipment just to visit Earth for a few hours. But humans lived there their whole lives without any protection at all. They breathed the dangerous air and walked around in the crushing gravity like it was nothing. The galaxy knew this, but they did not really understand what it meant. They saw Minji and thought she looked weak and fragile. They had no idea that her bones were 3 times denser than theirs, or that her muscles contained explosive power that could shatter their understanding of biology. As Minji walked through the academy, she passed groups of different alien species. The Velkari students were tall and graceful with blue skin that shimmered like water. They moved with elegant motions and spoke in musical voices. The Thornacs were thick and heavy with armored skin that looked like stone. They could hover. Cars with their bare hands and their voices sounded like grinding rocks. The Zephyrians were made of living crystal that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. They could think faster than any computer and solve complex math problems in seconds. All of these species were considered advanced and powerful. They controlled star systems and commanded fleets of warships. Their technology was thousands of years ahead of human science. They were the elite of galactic civilization, and then there was Minji looking like a child who had wandered into the wrong building. Her first class was Basic Galactic History, taught by Professor Velthan, who was a elderly Velkari with silver skin and kind eyes. When Minji entered the classroom, the conversation stopped and everyone turned to stare at her. She found an empty seat in the back row and sat down quietly. Professor Velthan welcomed her to the class and asked her to introduce herself to the other students. Minji stood up and spoke in careful galactic standard language that she was still learning. She told them her name and that she came from Earth in the Sol system. She said she was honored to be at the academy and hoped to learn from her classmates. Her voice was soft and polite. When she finished speaking, she sat down and several students laughed quietly. One Velkari student named Hayan turned around in his seat and looked at her with a smirk on his face. He asked her in a loud voice why Earth had sent someone so small to represent their planet. He said maybe humans were even more primitive than everyone thought if this was the best they could do. Other students joined in the laughter. A Thornax named Deho said that humans must be very weak if their gravity was so light that they never developed proper strength. A Zephyrian made a comment about human technology being so backward that they still used paper and writing tools, like ancient civilizations. Minji listened to all of this without changing her expression. Her face remained calm and peaceful, like she was hearing comments about the weather. She opened her leather bag and took out a notebook made of actual paper and a simple pen. While the other students continued to make jokes about her, she began, taking notes on the lecture. Professor Velthan tried to quiet the class and continue with his lesson, but the students kept making whispered comments about the strange human girl. They wondered why the academy had lowered its standards to accept someone so obviously inferior. Some felt sorry for her and thought she would probably fail all her classes and go home in shame. During lunch break, Minji sat alone at a table while groups of alien students continued to discuss her like she was not there. They debated whether humans were actually intelligent or if they were just clever animals that had learned to use tools. They speculated about how weak human bodies must be if they came from such a dangerous planet. The logic seemed backward to them. What none of them understood was that Earth had not made humans weak. It had made them into something the galaxy had never seen before. Every day of human evolution had been a battle for survival against a planet that was actively trying to kill them. The gravity that crushed other species had made human bones incredibly dense and strong. The dangerous atmosphere had given them lungs that could process almost anything. The violent weather and deadly predators had shaped them into creatures that could adapt to any threat. But Minji looked so small and harmless that no one suspected any of this. She finished her lunch quietly and went to her next class. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere, but she seemed not to notice them. She took notes with her primitive pen and paper while other students used advanced holographic displays. She answered questions in her careful accent while others spoke in perfect galactic standard. By the end of the first day, word had spread throughout the academy about the strange human student. Some teachers felt sorry for her and wondered if she would be able to keep up with the advanced curriculum. Students made bets about how long she would last before giving up and returning to her backward planet. None of them noticed how Minji moved through the corridors like she was mapping every exit and measuring every distance. They did not see how her eyes tracked the movements of every person around her, or how she seemed to be constantly calculating angles and trajectories. They had no idea they were sharing space with a creature whose species had spent millions of years learning to hunt and kill the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The galaxy was about to learn what a human really was. Taeho was everything the galaxy considered perfect in a student. He stood 2.5 meters tall with the characteristic blue skin and graceful build of the Velkari species. His family controlled 3 entire star systems and owned the largest shipping company in the Outer Rim territories. Money and power flowed through his bloodline like water through a river. At the academy, Taeho was treated like royalty because his family donated enormous amounts of credits to keep the institution running. Teachers smiled at him even when he skipped classes or turned in poor work. Other students competed for his attention because being friends with someone so wealthy and connected could change their entire future. Taeho had never been told no in his entire life. When he wanted something, he simply took it. When someone annoyed him, he made sure they regretted it. The academy staff looked the other way when he pushed smaller students around or demanded their lunch money. His family was too important to upset over minor disciplinary issues. He first noticed Minji during combat theory class on her second day at the academy, while other students took notes on advanced holopads that projected 3-dimensional images. Into the air, she used an actual notebook made of paper and wrote with a primitive pen. The sight of such backward technology made him laugh out loud. Professor Kelton was discussing defensive strategies when he asked for student input on how to handle multiple attackers. Most students suggested calling for backup or using advanced weapons systems. When Minji raised her small hand, Taeho rolled his eyes and prepared to hear something stupid. Instead, Minji suggested using environmental hazards as weapons and turning enemies against each other through careful positioning. She talked about fighting in close quarters, where numbers became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. She described tactics that sounded completely insane to everyone listening. The professor looked thoughtful and asked her to explain further. Minji stood up and walked to the front of the classroom where she used simple drawings to show how a Single Fighter could defeat multiple opponents by controlling space and timing. Her strategies involved accepting damage in order to deal greater damage in return. The class erupted in laughter. A Thornax student named Junho said that only a Nieda idiot would choose to get hurt on purpose. A Zephyrian called her tactics primitive and barbaric. Even Professor Kelthan seemed uncomfortable with how violent her suggestions were. Taeho decided at that moment that this tiny human needed to learn her place in the galactic hierarchy. She was acting like she belonged here when clearly she was. Just a primitive savage from a backward planet. Someone needed to teach her some respect, and Taeho was happy to volunteer for the job. He started small at first. When Minji walked through the corridors between classes, he would bump into her shoulder and send her stumbling. He would time it perfectly so that her books and papers scattered across the floor. Then he would apologize loudly and claim it was an accident while his friends laughed at the sight of the human girl crawling around picking up her primitive supplies. During meals in the great dining hall, Taeho would walk past her table and make comments about Death World primitives who did not understand civilized behavior. He spoke just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. His friends would join in with their own jokes about human intelligence and technology. In the library, Taeho would find whatever table Minji was using and sit down with his large group of followers. They would talk loudly about important galactic families and expensive purchases until she was forced to move somewhere else. Then they would follow her to the next table and repeat the process. The strange thing was that Minji never reacted to any of this harassment. She would simply pick up her scattered belongings without complaint. She would move to a different table without argument. When Taeho made loud insults about her species, she would continue eating her meal like nothing had happened. Her calm responses only made Taeho angrier. In his experience, people who were being bullied would either fight back or break down crying or run to authority figures for help. Minji did none of these things. She acted like his attacks were just minor inconveniences, like rain or delayed transport schedules. Other students watched these interactions with mixed feelings. Some felt bad for the human girl, but no one wanted to become Taeho's next target by defending her. Others thought she deserved the treatment for being so strange and different. Most just found the whole situation entertaining. What none of them noticed was how Minji tracked every movement around her with perfect awareness. Her eyes would follow Taeho when he approached, even when she seemed to be focused on other things. She seemed to be measuring distances and calculating angles whenever he got close to her. During physical education class, the differences between species became even more obvious. The Velkari students moved with liquid grace through obstacle courses, designed for their build. The Thornax powered through strength challenges that would have crushed lighter species. The Zephyrians solved puzzle courses faster than anyone could follow. Minji struggled with equipment that was sized for much larger beings. She had to jump to reach handholds that others could simply grab. Her times were slow compared to students who had natural advantages. Taeho made sure to comment loudly about human weakness and inadequacy. But there were moments when something seemed off about Minji's performance. Sometimes she would move with sudden speed that surprised everyone watching. Other times she would lift weights that should have been too heavy for someone her size. When questioned about it, she would simply say she was trying her best. The academy medical staff ran routine health checks on all students, and Minji's results confused them completely. Her bone density was far higher than expected. Her muscle fiber composition was unlike anything they had seen. Her cardiovascular system seemed designed for extreme stress. When they asked her about it, she explained that these were normal human traits. Taeho heard about these medical anomalies and decided they were probably mistakes or lies. Humans were clearly weak, primitive creatures, and no amount of strange test results would convince him otherwise. If anything, the reports made him more determined to put Minji in her proper place. He began planning something bigger than casual, hallway bumps or dining hall insults. He wanted to humiliate her in front of as many witnesses as possible. He wanted to make her cry or beg or run away so that everyone would see how pathetic humans really were. The perfect opportunity came during advanced physics class. Professor Yelton always turned his back to the class when writing equations on the holographic board. The classroom would be full of students from multiple grade levels. It would be the ideal moment to show everyone what happened when Death whirled. Primitives tried to play with their betters. Taiho spent days planning exactly what he would do and when he would do it. He imagined Minji's shocked face when he struck her. He pictured her crying and begging him to stop. He thought about how impressed everyone would be with his dominance over the inferior human. What Taiho did not know was that humans had spent millions of years as persistence hunters who tracked dangerous prey across entire continents. They had evolved to read body language and predict movement patterns with deadly accuracy. Minji had been watching him plan his attack for days, and she was ready for whatever he intended to do. The galaxy was about to learn why Earth was called a death world. Advanced physics class was held in one of the Academy's largest lecture halls. Students from different grade levels attended because Professor Yelton was considered the best teacher in the entire institution. The room was packed with over 200 beings from dozens of species, all eager to learn about gravitational mechanics and space-time manipulation. Minji sat in her usual spot near the front of the classroom with her paper notebook open and her primitive pen ready. Around her, the other students used floating holographic displays that showed complex three-dimensional models and interactive equations. The contrast between her simple tools and their advanced technology made her stand out even more than usual. Taiho had positioned himself in the seat directly behind Minji several days earlier. He had been planning this moment carefully and wanted to make sure he had the perfect angle of attack. His friends sat nearby, ready to witness what they expected to be an entertaining display of human weakness. Professor Yelton began the lecture by discussing how different planetary masses affected local gravity fields. He used examples from famous worlds throughout the galaxy to illustrate his points. When he mentioned Earth as an example of a high-gravity world, several students turned to look at Minji with renewed interest. The professor explained that Earth had nearly twice the gravitational pull of most inhabited worlds. He said that creatures who evolved there would naturally develop denser bones and stronger muscles to cope with the constant pressure. Some students started to understand why Minji might be different from what they had assumed, but Taiho was not paying attention to the lecture. He was focused entirely on the back of Minji's head and the moment when he would make his move. He had spent days imagining how satisfying it would be to finally put this primitive human in her place in front of so many witnesses. As Professor Yelthan turned toward the holographic board to write a complex equation, Taiho saw his opportunity. The classroom fell silent as students focused on copying down the mathematical formulas. This was the perfect moment for maximum impact, with minimum risk of teacher interference. Taiho rose slightly from his seat and brought his large hand back in preparation for a devastating blow. He intended to strike Minji across the back of her, head with enough force to knock her unconscious and send her tumbling to the floor. In his mind, he could already hear the gasps of shock and the laughter that would follow. His hand came down like a falling tree toward the back of Minji's skull. The sound of impact echoed through the silent classroom like a thunderclap that made every student jump in their seats. But something was wrong with what happened next. Instead of collapsing or crying out in pain, Minji simply paused in her note-taking. Her head had barely moved from the impact that should have rendered her unconscious. She slowly set down her pen and turned around in her seat to face Taiho with movements that seemed almost mechanical in their precision. The moment their eyes met, every survival instinct in the room began screaming warnings that something terrible was about to happen. Minji's face had changed completely from the calm, peaceful expression she always wore. Now her dark eyes held something that made rational thought difficult for anyone looking into them. Students who had been laughing and whispering seconds before suddenly felt like small prey animals in the presence of an apex predator. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The air felt charged with electricity like the moments before a lightning strike. Several students later swore they could smell ozone and copper in the atmosphere. Minji stood up slowly and deliberately. Even though she was still tiny compared to Taiho, something about her presence seemed to fill the entire classroom with menace. She did not say a word, but the threat she represented was clear to every being in the room. This was not the harmless primitive they had been mocking for days. Taiho tried to maintain his confident posture, but something deep in his brain was telling him to run as fast as possible. He had never experienced fear like this before. Looking into Minji's eyes was like staring into the heart of a black hole or the center of a dying star. Everything about her radiated danger in ways his mind could not process. But his pride would not allow him to back down, especially not in front of so many witnesses. He was Velkari nobility, and she was just a human from a backward planet. He had wealth and power and family connections that made him untouchable. This primitive creature could not possibly be a real threat to someone like him. Taiho raised his hand again, intending to deliver an even more devastating blow that would show everyone what real power looked like. He wanted to prove that humans were weak and pathetic despite their strange medical readings. He was going to establish the natural order with violence if necessary. What he did not understand was that he had just made the worst mistake of his entire life. He had attacked a member of a species that had evolved to hunt and kill the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. He had threatened a creature whose ancestors had spent millions of years perfecting the art of violence. Professor Yelthin continued, writing equations on the holographic board, completely unaware of what was happening behind him. The other students sat frozen in their seats as they watched Taiho's second attack begin. Time seemed to slow down as his hand descended toward Minji once again. The security cameras throughout the classroom were recording everything in perfect detail. Later analysis would show that what happened next lasted exactly 3.7 seconds from beginning to end. But those few seconds would change how the entire galaxy viewed humanity forever. Minji did not just dodge or block the incoming attack. She exploded into motion with speed that should not have been possible for any organic creature. Her response was not defensive but aggressively offensive in ways that shocked everyone watching. Students started screaming before they even understood what they were seeing. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the classroom like gunshots. Blue blood began to spray across the walls and ceiling in patterns that would give witnesses nightmares for months afterward. Professor Yelthin spun around at the sound of the screaming and saw something that his mind refused to process. The most advanced medical facilities in the galaxy would need hours to repair the damage that Minji had inflicted in less than 4 seconds of violence. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. No one moved or spoke, or even breathed, as they tried to understand what had just occurred. The small human girl stood exactly where she had been before, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The galaxy was about to discover what humans were really capable of when threatened. The security recordings from that day would be studied by xenobiologists and combat analysts for decades afterward. 17 different cameras captured the events from multiple angles in perfect high-definition detail. Every frame was analyzed and measured and compared to understand exactly what had happened in those 3.7 seconds of violence. When Taiho's massive hand came down for the second strike, Minji moved with speed that defied every law of biology that the galaxy understood. Her small body accelerated from complete stillness to maximum velocity in less than 1/10 of a second. The sudden movement created a sound like cracking whips as she broke multiple sound barriers simultaneously. Her right fist shot upward toward Taiho's descending arm with precision that spoke of extensive combat training. The impact occurred at the exact moment when his elbow joint was most vulnerable to lateral stress. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the classroom like thunder as his forearm snapped in 3 separate places. Taiho began to scream in shock and agony, but the sound was cut short by what happened next. Before his broken arm had even finished falling, Minji had already pivoted her entire body and driven her left hand directly into his solar plexus with force that lifted his massive frame completely off the ground. The Velkari species had internal organs arranged differently from humans, but Minji seemed to know exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Her blow crushed several vital organs and sent shockwaves through Taeho's nervous system that shut down his higher brain functions instantly. As his body doubled over from the devastating impact to his torso, Minji's knee came up to meet his falling, faced with the velocity and precision of a guided missile. The collision generated enough force to power a small starship for several hours. The front half of Taeho's skull simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Bone fragments scattered across the classroom like shrapnel from an explosion. Students dove under their desks or threw themselves behind chairs as pieces of Velkari. Skull embedded themselves in walls and furniture. Blue blood painted the ceiling and walls in abstract patterns that looked like modern art created by a madman. Taeho's body flew backward through the air and crashed through two student desks before, sliding across the polished floor and coming to rest against the far wall. He left a trail of blue blood that stretched nearly 10 meters from where the impact had occurred to where his unconscious form finally stopped moving. The entire sequence from first contact to final impact had lasted exactly 3.7 seconds. In that brief span of time, Minji had inflicted injuries that would require the most advanced medical technology in the galaxy to repair. Multiple bones were shattered beyond recognition. Internal organs were ruptured or completely destroyed. Brain tissue was scattered across half the classroom. Throughout the entire encounter, Minji had moved with the fluid efficiency of a natural predator. Every strike had been perfectly timed and precisely targeted for maximum damage. There were no wasted motions or unnecessary flourishes. She had applied exactly the amount of force needed to neutralize the threat, and not one erg more. When the violence ended, Minji stood in exactly the same position she had occupied before the attack began. She was not even breathing heavily despite having just performed feats of physical prowess that should have been impossible. There was not a single drop of Taeho's blood on her clothing or skin. She calmly reached down and picked up the pen she had dropped when turning to face her attacker. Her notebook had fallen to the floor during the brief confrontation, and she retrieved that as well. Then she sat back down in her seat and continued taking notes on Professor Yelthan's lecture as if nothing unusual had occurred. The silence in the classroom was absolute and terrifying. 200 students from dozens of different species sat frozen in shock as they tried to process what they had witnessed. Many would require psychological counseling in the weeks that followed to deal with the trauma of seeing such sudden and brutal violence. Professor Yelthan stood at the holographic board with equations half finished, trying to understand what had just happened in his classroom. In 30 years of teaching, he had never seen anything like this level of destruction, inflicted by a single individual. The casual efficiency of it was beyond anything in his experience. Several students were crying or hyperventilating as the reality of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at the trail of blue blood that marked where Taeho's body had slid across the floor. A few were quietly vomiting into trash receptacles as their minds rejected the violent images. The Academy security system had automatically alerted emergency medical personnel the moment it detected the massive kinetic impacts. Paramedics rushed into the classroom, expecting to find the aftermath of some kind of industrial accident or terrorist attack. Instead, they found one unconscious Velkari student and a small human girl taking notes. The medical team immediately began working on Taeho while calling for additional support and specialized equipment. His injuries were unlike anything they had encountered before. The damage was so extensive that it took several minutes just to identify which body parts belonged where. While the paramedics fought to stabilize their patient, students began to file out of the classroom in shocked silence. They moved like survivors of a natural disaster, stepping carefully around pools of blue blood and scattered debris. Many cast fearful glances at Minji as they passed, but none dared to speak to her or ask what had happened. Academy security officers arrived to investigate the incident but found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. The security recordings clearly showed that Taiho had initiated the confrontation by striking Minji first. Her response could be classified as self-defense under galactic law, but the level of force she had used seemed completely disproportionate to the threat she had faced. When questioned about the incident, Minji explained calmly that she had been attacked and had defended herself. She seemed genuinely confused by all the attention and concern. In her mind, she had simply responded to aggression with appropriate countermeasures. The fact that everyone else considered her response excessive never seemed to occur to her. The medical team worked for over an hour to stabilize Taiho enough for transport to the Academy Hospital. His condition was critical, and the doctors were not certain he would survive the journey. The amount of reconstructive surgery required would be unprecedented in galactic medical history. As the medical team prepared to move Taiho to intensive care, word of the incident began to spread throughout the Academy. Students called their friends and family to share news of the incredible violence they had witnessed. Within hours, the story would reach news networks across the galaxy. The small human girl who had seemed so harmless had just demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about Death World species. The implications of what had occurred in that classroom would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Minji finished copying the last equation from Professor Yeltan's lecture and closed her notebook. She packed her primitive supplies into her leather bag and prepared to leave for her next class. The fact that she had just hospitalized the heir to one of the galaxy's most powerful families seemed to concern her not at all. The galaxy was about to learn that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Academy Medical Center had never seen injuries like the ones Taiho sustained in those 3 seconds of violence. Emergency surgical teams worked in shifts for 14 straight hours just to keep him alive while they tried to piece together what remained of his skull and face. The damage was so extensive that they had to completely redesign their approach to Velkari anatomy. Dr. Kento, the head of emergency medicine, called in specialists from across the galaxy to help with the reconstruction. Plastic surgeons who normally worked on wealthy celebrities found themselves trying to rebuild a face from scattered fragments. Neurologists studied brain scans that showed trauma patterns unlike anything in medical literature. The surgical team had to use synthetic materials to replace most of Taiho's skull because so much bone had been completely destroyed. His jaw was rebuilt from scratch using titanium frameworks that would take months to integrate with his remaining tissue. The damage to his brain meant he would need years of therapy to relearn basic functions like speech and movement. While doctors fought to save Taiho's life, the Academy administration went into full crisis mode. Emergency meetings were called at all hours as officials tried to understand what had happened and how to respond. The legal implications alone were staggering since Taiho came from one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. Security footage was analyzed frame by teams of experts who could barely believe what they were seeing. Biomechanics specialists calculated the forces involved and concluded that Minji had generated enough kinetic energy to power a small city. The speed of her movements exceeded what most starship engines could achieve. Xenobiologists were brought in to study the recordings and try to understand how a human could possibly move that fast or strike with such devastating force. They compared Minji's capabilities to known species throughout the galaxy and found no precedents for this level of physical performance in a being her size. The galactic media exploded with news of the incident within hours of it occurring. Students had recorded videos on their personal devices and uploaded them to social networks before Academy officials could stop them. The footage spread across civilized space faster than the Academy could control the narrative. Headlines screamed variations of Death World student destroys Academy elite and human girl sends nobility to hospital in seconds. News networks ran the security footage on continuous loops while experts debated what it meant for interstellar relations. The images of Tai-Ho's destruction became the most viewed content in galactic history. Talk show hosts brought on military analysts to discuss human combat capabilities. Scientists appeared on educational programs to explain how evolution on a high gravity world might produce such results. Political commentators debated whether humans should be allowed in galactic institutions if they were capable of such violence. Fear and fascination spread through civilized space like wildfire. Some species called for immediate restrictions on human travel and education. Others demanded more research into Earth and its population. A few military organizations quietly began recruiting human mercenaries for specialized combat roles. At the academy itself, Minji became the most famous and feared student in the institution's long history overnight. Other students gave her a wide berth in hallways, afraid to make eye contact or accidentally bump into her. Even large and powerful species like the thornax seemed nervous when she was nearby. Teachers spoke to her with careful politeness and made sure never to criticize her work too harshly. Professor Yelthan canceled his advanced physics class for a week, claiming he needed time to process what had occurred in his classroom. Several other instructors requested transfers to different institutions rather than risk teaching the dangerous. Human Academy security guards, who were trained warriors from military species, watched Minji nervously whenever she moved through the building. They had seen the footage of what she could do, and none of them wanted to test their skills against someone capable of such devastating violence. Special protocols were developed for dealing with any future incidents involving the human student, but the strangest aspect of the entire situation was Minji's reaction to all the attention and fear she had generated. She seemed genuinely confused by the fuss everyone was making about what she considered a minor altercation. When reporters tried to interview her, she politely declined and said she preferred to focus on her studies. During official questioning by Academy investigators, Minji explained that Tai-Ho had attacked her, so she had defended herself using appropriate force. She could not understand why everyone considered her response excessive or unusual. In her mind, she had simply done what any reasonable person would do when threatened by an aggressor. When investigators asked if she felt any remorse for the injuries she had inflicted, Minji looked puzzled by the question. She explained that Tai-Ho had chosen to initiate violence, so he was responsible for the consequences of his actions. She had simply responded to his aggression in the most efficient manner possible. The most disturbing part of her statement came when investigators asked if she could have used less force to stop the attack. Minji thought about this for several moments, before explaining that she had actually held back significantly because she did not want to cause permanent damage to another student. She mentioned almost casually that on Earth, her response would have been considered quite restrained. She could have inflicted much more severe injuries if she had felt truly threatened. The fact that she considered complete facial reconstruction to be holding back sent chills through everyone who heard her testimony. Medical experts studying the case concluded that if Minji had used her full strength, the impact would have been equivalent to being hit by a small asteroid. Tai-Ho's head would have simply exploded like a ripe fruit, instead of being merely destroyed. The restraint she had shown may have been the only thing that saved his life. Galaxy-wide polls showed that public opinion was sharply divided about humans and their place in civilized society. Some groups demanded immediate restrictions on human movement and activities. Others argued that humans had been provoked and had every right to defend themselves. Military strategists quietly began revising their assessments of human combat capabilities. The Velkari government officially demanded justice for the attack on one of their nobles, but their protests were complicated by the clear evidence that Tai-Ho had initiated the violence. Galactic courts struggled to determine appropriate charges when the victim had clearly been the aggressor and the defendant had acted in self-defense. Tai-Ho's family hired the best lawyers in the galaxy to pursue criminal and civil cases against Minji, but their efforts were hampered by the security footage that showed their son attacking first. Public sympathy for their cause was limited since most beings considered Taiho to have brought his injuries on himself through his own poor choices. Meanwhile, humans throughout the galaxy found themselves treated with a new mixture of respect and fear. Employers who had previously overlooked human job applications suddenly became very interested in hiring workers from Earth. Criminals who had targeted humans as easy victims quickly learned to find other prey. The Academy struggled to return to normal operations as students and faculty tried to process what they had witnessed. Counseling services were overwhelmed with requests for help dealing with trauma and anxiety. Many students transferred to other institutions rather than remain in the same building as the dangerous human. Minji continued attending her classes and taking notes with her primitive pen and paper as if nothing had changed. Her academic performance remained excellent despite the chaos surrounding her. She seemed genuinely unaware of the fear and fascination she had generated throughout the galaxy. The incident had lasted less than 4 seconds, but its consequences would reshape how civilized space. The Academy's investigation revealed shocking truths about human development that changed how the galaxy viewed death worlds forever. Earth wasn't just dangerous because of its environment. It had created something unprecedented, a species that was simultaneously intelligent and predatory on a level that defied galactic understanding. Humans, they learned, were persistence hunters who had evolved to chase prey across continents until it collapsed from exhaustion. Their bones were designed to withstand impacts that would shatter other species. Their muscles could deliver explosive force while maintaining fine motor control. Their nervous systems processed combat situations faster than most species could. Think. They were living weapons disguised as scholars. The revelation that Earth had produced an entire species of beings like Minji terrified and fascinated the galactic community. Suddenly, humanity's rapid advancement in technology and exploration made sense. They weren't just lucky or clever. They were apex predators who had turned their hunting instincts toward conquering the stars. Minji finished her education at the Academy without any further incidents. No one was foolish enough to challenge her again. She graduated with highest honors and returned to Earth, where she was welcomed as a hero who had shown the galaxy what humans were truly capable of. But her legacy lived on in galactic culture. New regulations were put in place for accepting Death World species into advanced institutions. Combat training programs were completely redesigned based on human fighting techniques. The phrase "hitting like a human" became slang for devastating force across 1,000 worlds. Years later, when humanity officially joined the Galactic Council, they were granted a seat at the high table immediately. No one voted against them. No one questioned their qualifications. The memory of what one small human girl had done to someone who challenged her was fresh in everyone's minds. The galaxy learned an important lesson that day. Never underestimate someone from a death world. They might look small and harmless, but they carry the fury of their entire planet in their bones. And if you're foolish enough to strike first, you better hope they're feeling merciful.